Hey class. In this video, I'm going to be talking about conditional logic. Conditional logic probably sounds like a big term, but it's just a way in programming that we make decisions about what we want to do with our code. And so that allows us to do more interesting things with our code, to change our code over time, and to make more complex programs. So I'm going to start with a new example here, but eventually I'll bring in the image and the text that we used last week. So you could create a meme or a logo that's actually interactive, that makes changes based on different conditions. So I'll go over how to use conditional logic. Let's get started and set up our development environment first. So here I am on the desktop, as usual. I'm going to open up GitHub Desktop. So I'm in my MMP 210 repository. Just want to make sure I'm up to date. And I'm going to start with a new project. So I'm going to click Show in Finder, and I'm going to duplicate my meme folder. I can hit Command D on the Mac, or Command C, Command V to copy and paste. On the Windows, I can do Control C, Control V to copy and paste. And I'm just going to name this meme version 2. Again, this is another part of our meme/logo project. So if you're working on a logo, feel free to call it logo, whatever you prefer here. And then I'm just going to go ahead and drag my MMP 210 folder over to Sublime Text to open it up. And my sidebar was hidden. So if you ever have that issue, you can go to View and go to Show Sidebar. So if you don't see the sidebar for some reason, just go to Show Sidebar. There it is. And here's our meme version 2. I'm going to open up index.html and just change a couple things here. So meme version 2. That's pretty much it. And then I'm going to open up sketch.js, and I'm going to delete everything in here and just kind of start from scratch. So I might come back and grab my images later, but I want to talk about how conditional logic works first. So I'm just going to start from scratch in this version. So here we are with meme version 2, conditional logic. And so what conditional logic is in programming is basically just making decisions with code. And in programming, we always have to reduce our decisions to one or two choices. When you're making a complex decision, there may be a lot of different variables or factors that go into making that decision. But ultimately, the decision-making process tends to rely on binaries, like do I do this or do I do that? So for an example, we might, when we're deciding to get dressed in the morning, we might be considering what to wear, and we might say, do I want to wear a jacket? So the condition for whether I want to wear a jacket is whether or not it's cold outside. So I ask myself, is it cold? If the answer is yes, then I wear a jacket. If the answer is no, then, no jacket. So that's like a very simple condition. The condition is it cold? And yes or no are the two options, and then the outcome is either a jacket or no jacket. That's one example of a condition. You might have other factors. So you might say, is it snowing first? So if it's snowing and cold, so if I say, is it snowing? Is it snowing might be the first condition. Is it cold might be my second condition. If one is yes and the other is yes, that might lead me to, get a snow jacket. If one is no and the other is still yes, then maybe I'd wear a lighter jacket. If they're both no, then I probably wouldn't wear any jacket at all. With programming, the computer really only understands like a value that's true or false. So when we're talking about making decisions, we usually reduce our decisions to true or false. Okay, and with the computer, we also can think of those values as 0 for false and 1 for true. So the computer tends to see things in binaries because the way that electricity works is either on or off, right? So on can be true and off can be false. And so when we reduce decisions we want to make in our code, using binaries is an easy way to tell the computer what we want to do. And this idea of true versus false is known as a Boolean. So you'll hear me use the term Boolean a lot. And a Boolean is just any value that is only true or false. It's the third big data type that we've looked at. Remember, we have numbers. So numbers can be 0, 1, 100, all the way up to infinity. Numbers can also be like 0.01. All of those things are numbers. We also have strings, and strings can be any string. So it could be, hello, could be goodbye. Strings can also contain numbers like 1, 2, 3, or maybe if you had a password that was like A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, although that would be a pretty bad password. Boolean is the third big data type in JavaScript. So Booleans are always either true or false. There's only two possibilities. Some values in JavaScript will resolve to be one of those values. So in JavaScript, we have true, and sometimes this is referred to as truthy values, and then we have falsy values. JavaScript's kind of a weird language. This is useful in some cases and confusing in others, but some values that are true are like 1, 2, 3, and also -1, -2, -3, up to infinity. The only value of number that's false is 0. Strings are true, like the string hello. A string with no characters, or an empty string, is false. There's some other values that kind of go in one place or the other, but we won't go into that quite yet. Let's set up our sketch and start demonstrating how this actually works in practical terms. As with any sketch, I'm going to start with a setup function, and I'm going to create my canvas. Just do a normal 640 by 360. Then I'll create my function draw. And I'm going to do a background. I'll just do a black background for this one. And we're just going to look at a very simple Boolean value. So this Boolean is called mouseIsPressed. And actually, let's go look at this in the documentation before we use it in our code. So if you go to reference and go to events, we've already used events like mouseX and mouseY. We have another event called mouseIsPressed. You can kind of guess what that does is it tells you whether or not the mouse is pressed. So you can see in this example, if I press the mouse, it changes the shape. And mouseIsPressed is another system variable like mouseX, mousey, but it's a Boolean value. So it's only true or false. So we can visualize that. I'm just going to put some text on the screen and show mouseIsPressed. I'll put that in the middle of the screen. And let's make it kind of big so we can read it. And then I'm going to run my Sublime server and go back to my browser. And go to localhost 80. 80 as usual, open up MMP 210. I haven't made the link for this yet, so I'm just going to type it into the URL. So this is meme v2. And it looks like there's nothing there at the moment because my background is the same color as my text. So let's change the fill here to white. Guess I could have also changed the background. So see, it says false. And when I'm holding the mouse down, you just have to take my word for it because you can't see my mouse. It says true. Okay, so it's only ever true or false. If I take this same text box and instead of mouseIsPressed, I put in mouseX, and I'm just gonna move it down a bit. So mouseX changes as I move the mouse back and forth across the screen. I don't know why it seems to always be 0.5. But anyway, so there's a lot of different values for that mouse value, but with the mouse pressed, it's only ever true or false. And so we know basically whether or not the user is clicking on the mouse at any given time. That's a binary or Boolean value. There's only two possibilities, that I'm clicking on the mouse or that I'm not. So we can describe that as a Boolean. So how do we use a Boolean? Well, we can use a Boolean to make decisions. The way that I make a decision, let's say I wanted to draw a different background if the user was pressing a mouse. I use the if keyword in JavaScript. So this is a new keyword. It's going to look a lot like a structure that we've seen a lot of, which is our functions. But instead of a function and a name at the beginning, it just uses the word if. And it's just like the question that we talked about earlier. If it's cold outside, I want to wear a jacket. So we just ask the question if. Then we have parentheses followed by curly brackets. And what goes in the parentheses is the condition that we're testing, if something is true or false. And what goes inside the curly brackets is the code that we want to run if the condition is true. So I'm going to put a line here. If the condition is true, I'm going to say the background is plum. So the condition that we're using here is just mouseIsPressed. So mouseIsPressed. Now, instead of showing us the value of mouseIsPressed, we'll see the result by looking at the background color. So when I go back here and reload, now we can see as I'm clicking, we get a pink background. And so you might be starting to imagine all of the different things that you can use this for, like creating a button, creating different interactions, clicking on things in a video game, or clicking on things in an application. Our HTML and CSS has kind of a version of this, right? Like if I hover over these links and then I click on them, something happens. Now we're kind of learning how that works in the actual code that HTML and CSS is built on. So if I click, I can change the color, and I can really do a lot of other things. I just have to create the condition through which I decide what changes in my code. So mouseIsPressed is a really simple Boolean system variable. It's either true or false. But sometimes conditions are more complicated than that. Sometimes conditions relate to time or position or size or other things like that. So let's look at some comparison operator. An operator in JavaScript is just like a plus or a minus, any symbol that we use to do math or other things. When we're using an if statement, we can also compare values. For example, I might want to draw a different color depending on where the mouse is on the screen. We can measure the position of the mouse. Remember, we can look at the mouse X position. So let's put this in the upper left corner just as a reference. And I'm going to make this just a little bit bigger because it is pretty hard to see. And let's move it down. So that's our mouse X value. So over here it's like 0, and over here it's like 640, whatever the width of the canvas is. I'm not really sure why the 0.5 is always there. I'm going to round this, so I'm not bothered by that. So we could decide to change the canvas color based on the position of the mouse, not just if we're clicking or not. But to do that, we have to use the number of the mouse value and compare that to another value. So let's put a line down the middle of the canvas. So I'm going to put a line. I'm going to start at width over 2. And so I'm going to start in the middle of the canvas, wherever that happens to be. And I'm going to start at 0 at the top of the canvas. And X is going to stay width over 2 because I'm just staying in one line going down to the bottom. And Y will be height. So it'll go down all the way to the bottom. And we need to change the stroke to 255 as well. And let's make it a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. Although it kind of makes my text look bad. I'm being a little finicky here. There's not really that good of a reason to do this. Anyway, so now we can kind of see where the middle of our canvas is. And so what I want to demonstrate is that we can detect whether the mouse is on this side or this side using a very simple condition. And so I'm going to first just draw that, and then I'll use a Boolean for that. After I show the mouse X, when I make a condition, I'm basically comparing two values. And I have a few different comparison operators that allow me to do that. So I'm just gonna draw the text of this first. I'm gonna look at mouse X, and I'm gonna ask, is it greater than width over 2? And so I'm just gonna show the answer to that first. So I'll put that at like 1030. So now you see that true or false value. I'll move it down a little bit more to make it easier to see. And so basically what we're asking is if this number is bigger than or less than whatever number is represented by this line. And we can also draw that number. So I'll just say, I'll just add some strings together. So I'll say greater than plus width over 2. So I probably haven't talked about this before, but one thing I can do with strings is I can actually add them together. So if I want to show a little bit more information on my sketch, I can just add the symbol here so I can see the two values that I'm actually comparing. Now, if I put the mouse on the left side of the screen, it says 215 is greater than 320. That's obviously not true. The result of that is false. If I move my mouse to the right side of the screen, now the value of the mouse X is 460. And that is, of course, greater than 320. So that is true. So we can see the false value changing to true just by moving the mouse. And then we can use that condition to change something about our sketch. So I'll change the background color again. I'll say if mouse X is greater than width over 2. So again, if the mouse is on the right side of the canvas, then I'll draw the background is plum. So now we have the black background and the plum background. And so part of the trick of using logic and conditions in JavaScript is figuring out how to describe the condition that we want to create. There isn't that much usefulness to sort of crossing this line, but this is kind of an abstract version of something that we can use to create buttons or animations or other types of interactions. So let's look at our other comparison operators. I'm just going to move this out of the way for a minute. And I'll leave those numbers on the screen, but remove the comparison just so we can see. Besides greater than, we have less than. Okay, so that's going to be the opposite condition. So less than 320, we get plum, and greater than, we get black. There's also equal to. So that's two equal signs. Unlike, variable x equals 10 or whatever, when we're doing a conditional, we actually use two equal signs so that we can separate the meaning of this equality here versus this assignment here. So it's a little confusing because in math, equals x equals 10 just basically means that these two values are equal. In programming, this actually is assignment, right? It's assigning the value 10 to the variable x. So it's a little confusing. It's not actually the same thing as math. But what we use in programming is the double equal sign. So this value has to be the same as this value. So this one's going to be tricky. I'm going to have to be exactly on the line here. And I think because for whatever reason it's like always 0.5, I'm going to get that off. So let's do round mouse X. So I'm just going to round off that 0.5 value. There we go. So if I get right there exactly at that number, then we get the plum background when they're both 320. But any other value is just going to be black. So those are kind of our basic ones. We also have greater than and equal to, less than and equal to. I'll use these like in context as we go through more examples. But those are our basic three comparison operators: greater than, less than, or equal to. There's also not equal to, but again, we'll look at that when we get to relevant examples. So I'm going to return to one of our previous examples. Okay, mouse X is greater than width over 2. So with our condition, we have like what happens if this is true, right? If it's cold, wear a jacket. But we also need the opposite. So sometimes this works fine if you want to draw a black background and then draw a plum background. You don't have to add anything else. But if we want something else to happen, if this condition is false, we can use what's called an else statement. So the else statement goes directly after the bracket of the if statement ends, and then we open a new bracket. And it doesn't really matter if you put this on the next line or something like that, but it just has to go directly after this bracket. We say else, and then we have another bracket. So if we wanted to do another background color, we could say it's gold. And so now we have gold on the left, less than, and plum on the right, greater than. And this would work with our mouseIsPressed Boolean or any other condition that we would want to create. So at this point, you've probably already wondered, what if I have 3 different colors that I want to draw? And so let's do another example where we're actually going to draw a stoplight. So we'll have a green, yellow, and red for our stoplight, and we'll show it based on where our mouse position is. So we can look at the mouse Y in this case instead of mouse X to show that it's not just mouse X. We can use any value like the frame count or anything else on the screen to create these conditions. And besides just drawing the background, we can also draw colors or change a fill or anything else like that. So let's go ahead and create that. So first I'll just create my condition. So what we want to do is divide our canvas into 3 sections using the height. So let's come up with some values first. So we can draw our stop sign in the middle of the canvas. So I'll say X for the stop sign for each light is width over 2. And then we need to know the height of the canvas. So I'm going to say let H for height. And so we want height over 3 because there's 3 ellipses. So then let's draw the 3 ellipses. So we'll say ellipse at X. And for Y, we can increase by half the height. So we'll say height over 2, so it'll be centered. And then we'll use height for h. So that should be our first ellipse. So then we want to draw 2 more ellipses. So I'm just going to copy this and paste and paste. And we're going to go up by h each time. So just to be clear what's happening. So we divided the height into 3. So if this is the whole height, then height divided by 3 is approximately like, you know, somewhere around here, somewhere around here. And so each one of these is equivalent to 1 height. Since the ellipse draws from the center, we know that's h over 2. And so to get down here, we just have to add 1 more h. And then to get down here, we're going to add a second h. So for our second one, we'll say plus h. And for our last one, we'll say plus h times 2. You could say plus h as well, but to make it simpler, let's say h times 2. So there are 3 ellipses. Now we only want to draw 1 depending on where we are on the screen. So let's make it so that we only see 1 ellipse as we move the mouse up and down. So we have to create our condition. So mouse Y is what's changing as we go down our page. So if mouse Y is less than height divided by 3, so 1/3 of the canvas, we already have a value for this, which is h, so I can just use h here. So then we'll draw that first ellipse. So let's test that. I'm going to comment out these other ellipses and just test this real quick. So yes, we see that the mouse, that first ellipse draws as long as my mouse is up there in the top third. And then if I go down here, it disappears. So we have to add our other conditions. And that's where else if comes into play. So we looked at else, that's if the other, else is if there's only 2 conditions. Else if is if we have more than 1. And we can add as many as these as we want. For now, we're just going to be adding 1 because we only have 3 possible outcomes. So now we go to mouse Y is less than h times 2. So we're moving twice as far down. And I'm just going to grab, so I'll just grab the ellipse from there. And let's try that. Oh, forgot the Y. Okay, so now we have 2 ellipses, and I can move back and forth. Now, you might be thinking, oh, we can add another else if mouse Y is less than da-da-da. But actually, at this point, we know there's only 3 possibilities, and we know that 1 and 2 didn't hit, right? We knew that this condition wasn't true. We knew that this condition wasn't true. So that way, we don't actually need to bother figuring out whether the third condition is true. We know if the first 2 conditions are false, and there's only 3 conditions, that this third condition is true, so we just end with else. This type of structure is very common, and it often is referred to as a ladder or a conditional ladder. Or sometimes it's referred to as an if-else ladder. So this is when we have multiple conditions. And the order actually does matter here, and I'll show you why in a moment. So we have h times 2, and h times 3. We have our 3 ellipses. And the reason that the order matters, if we look at our logic and then map it out against our program. So let's look at it. So let's say this is our canvas. This is our first ellipse, h. Our second ellipse, h times 2. And our third ellipse, h times 3. Okay, so this value is h, 0, h times 2. Those are really the only ones that matter. Okay, so the reason that the order of our conditions matters is if I were to say, you know, if mouse Y is less than h times 2 first, if that was the first condition that I asked. So if my mouse was up here, right, that would still be true. And so if that was true, I would never get to my else if condition. Okay, so let's see that in practice. So if I switch these 2 conditions, I'm going to put these on a new line so it's a little bit easier to see. So if I take this condition and I put it up here, and then I'm going to move the else down here. Okay, so I'm starting with mouse Y is less than h times 2. What we're going to see is now the first ellipse is always the middle one, and then I do get that third ellipse. But since my mouse, if it's less than h over 2 at any point, that's going to mean that this is true. And if this is true, then we're never going to get to this else if, because all the conditions that are true for here are also true for here. So the order that you put them in matters. It's a little confusing, but basically if you're using less than, you want to start with the smaller condition. If you're using greater than, you probably want to start with the larger condition. So I'm going to reverse this and put it back in order. And there's our stoplight. So let's actually add the colors in here, because so far I've just been drawing a shape or a background, but I can actually add as much code in here as I want. So I can say, for our top fill, this is green. For our top ellipse, and then for our bottom ellipse, this is yellow. And for the stop light, we get red. So I can really draw as much as, I can use as much code as I want inside of these conditional statements. It's essentially adding like a new part of our program. Like this draw function, everything we put in here gets drawn when we, draw our program. But between here and here, anything that I write in there gets drawn if this condition is true. So I could put text in here, I could put images in here, whatever I want to put in here will be drawn when the condition works. So I can use else if as many times as I want. If I had 4 circles that I wanted to draw or 5 circles that I wanted to draw, I can add as many conditions here as I want to the if-else ladder, or my conditional ladder. A couple things I want to go over to round out this video. So one thing is just a syntax thing. Okay, so I'm gonna delete this stuff just so I can demonstrate this real quick. So sometimes when you're looking at examples, you'll see something that looks like this. If mouse is pressed, and then instead of having brackets, you'll just see some code. So let's say there's an ellipse at width over 2, height over 2, and 100. So this is a perfectly acceptable way to write code. Let me draw a background so this is easier to understand. So that code still works. If mouse is pressed, then draw the ellipse. That's acceptable in JavaScript as long as there's only one thing that gets drawn afterwards. This is a little bit tricky, and I want to show you why. So I can also say something like else, draw a rectangle, and I'll draw the exact same rectangle. And what we'll see is a circle and then a rectangle if I'm not clicking the mouse. Okay, so again, I don't really need the curly brackets as long as I only have one condition. The place where this gets tricky is when it looks like I'm saying something. So if I'm saying if mouse is pressed, draw the ellipse, again, this still works. But if I put another line here, like let's say I put a rectangle at width over 2, height over 2, 100. So looking at this code briefly, you might think like, well, this rectangle is in this if statement, so it shouldn't draw when I first run. It should only draw when I'm clicking. But we can clearly see that's not the case. It's drawing all the time. And so the reason that that is with this if statement not using curly brackets, essentially this if statement is done when I get to here. If I put curly brackets in here, now it's going to actually do what it looks like it should do. Okay, it draws the circle and the rectangle when I'm clicking. That's not something you're going to like see all the time, but it is just something to look out for if you're, especially if you're looking at examples. I'm going to almost always use the curly brackets just to keep things simple, but you might be looking at other examples online or other tutorials or other things like that. And so if you see something like that, that's what's going on. So it's an acceptable way to write code, but it has this potential for errors that you don't have when you're using curly brackets. Okay, so another thing you might have been wondering about is what happens. I can put an if condition inside of a draw function. What happens if I put an if condition inside of another if condition? And that's something that you can totally do. So if we have if mouse is pressed, we might be drawing either an ellipse or a rectangle. So I could draw an ellipse. I'll do the same thing, width over 2, height over 2, 100. Okay, I could also, I'm just going to copy that and change it real quick. I could also be drawing a rectangle, right? So now I'm going to be drawing both of them. But what if I only want to draw one on one side and one on the other? Well, I can just introduce a new conditional statement. So what I could do is say, if mouse x is greater than width over 2. And again, this is just kind of an arbitrary condition just for the demonstration. So then I want to make sure to indent here. And then I can put an else statement here and put the rectangle over there. Again, this is just an example, so I'm just going to kind of go through this quickly. Now if I click, here's my circle on the right. Here's my rectangle when I'm on the left. And it kind of looks weird because they're not in the same place as the mouse, but I'm just using this as a demonstration. Actually, I can swap this for mouse X, mouse Y, so that it's more related to where the mouse is. Okay, so there's no shape if I'm not clicking, but if I'm clicking and moving around, then I get a different shape. So I can put as many conditional statements inside of other conditional statements as I want. That is what's called a nested statement. And you might have seen nested statements before in CSS and other things like that as well. Okay, one last example, and then that'll be it for this video. So you might be saying, well, I want the mouse to be pressed and the mouse to be greater than width over 2, but I don't really care about this other statement. So I'm going to delete that. And so now I have two if statements, but I'm only writing one line of code. And that seems kind of silly, right? Like, why would I need two separate if statements to write one line of code? Well, there is a way to fix that, and that's a compound conditional statement. And so there's two ways to add multiple conditions into one if statement. There's and operator, which basically means both things have to be true. And there's the or operator, which is the two straight lines. That's one's kind of weird. You probably haven't seen that character before, but it's on the backslash below the delete key, but holding shift, you can just make a straight line. So if you want the two conditions to be true, mouse is pressed and mouse X is greater than width over 2, I can just add this condition. So I'm going to copy that and put a double ampersand for and then paste that in here. And now I can get rid of these other lines and move this back. So now I have both of my conditions in one if statement. So now if I'm clicking, but I'm on the left side, I don't see anything. If I go to the right, now I see a circle. So I'm satisfying both of the conditions with the and. If I use or here, then it could be either or. So now if I'm over here, but I'm clicking, I get the circle. And if I'm over here and I'm not doing anything, I get the circle as well. So I can use or and to combine conditions in one conditional statement. And I can also do that as many times as I want. We'll see some examples later on in the semester where I use it like a bunch of times. But for now, there's a few different examples where you might want to use that. I'll get into that in the next video. So yeah, that's it for this video. I'm just showing a bunch of examples. In the second video, I'll actually show how to get our image and our text back and create some different things using logic to make some like interactive versions of our meme. I'm just gonna commit the changes that I have here, but really in the next video, I'll go over, how to start working on your interactive version of your meme for your homework. So here, I'm just gonna say for the summary, adds new meme version and commit to master, and I'll push that. And then in the next video, I'll be working on more of how to actually create our new project.